goal of this segment is to get a device or two or three into Cacti and show you how to create some graphs to display device information on a per interface or per counter basis. So we're going to go into devices. And you notice I have the local host here that comes by default. So we're going to add a new device and we're going to give it a friendly name and an IP address. This host template section allows Cacti to better understand how to interrogate the device and to provide device-specific information like Cisco router will produce interface and CPUs, and it'll make more sense when you see it here coming up in a second. But also we're going to configure another device that we're just going to use plain old SNMP with an OID to get to it. So for now we're going to choose Cisco router. We're going to leave the defaults. We're going to use SNMP version 1. And we're going to use a community value of public. Now, let's just talk briefly about SNMP on a Cisco device. I've outputted the config just a little bit and trimmed out just to show you the SNMP section here. I created an ACL to limit who can query a device via SNMP. So it's just my home network. I have a guest network as well, but that's excluded. Here I've got an SNMP community of public with a read-only, and it's referencing this ACL, ACL10. I've also got a private read-write community string. I've got the location, and I've got the chassis ID. So going back to this config, we'll notes go here. Always document everything, right? And we'll just hit create. And just like that, we got some device-specific information back. I've got my switch at 10.17. It's a Cisco switch. It's been up for 9 days. Host name, location. Had I filled in some contact information, that would be here as well. So simple as that, we have our first device created. So now let's go create some graphs for this. And graphs are outputs of interfaces in this case. So remember I used that Cisco template? Well, here's what it found. It went in and found the VLAN. It found my interfaces, it found the interface names, and it also pulled the descriptions. I have an interface description listed here. This is the interface I actually want to graph. So as simple as checking it, and then saying the type of graph I'd like to use. In-out bits, 64-bit counters, we can throw out some outliers, so it'll graph to the 95th percentile. It'll show total bandwidth over the interface. Great for those on metered internet connections if you're doing this at home. We can convert bits to bytes. So I'm just going to choose in and out bits and hit create. Success. You can see up here it created a graph of this switch for traffic on this interface. Now let's go throw it onto a graph, and the graph is this tab. Now if you notice, this tab is blank right now. If I look at the graph tree, I've got a local host. And here's my local host for this pod that I had configured. I want to customize this tree a little bit because in the end I'm going to add several devices to this. So I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to go back to the graph tree. You see here's the default tree. Click this guy. And now I can add hosts to the tree and I can customize the tree. So I'm going to add a tree item. I'm going to say it's in the root. It is going to be a header, meaning it's going to be a section. And I'm going to call this section gate. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a section, a header section in the root called gate. Hit create. So now if I go back and look at my graph, you notice now I've got a section here called gate. I've got a host called localhost. Again, that's my Raspberry Pi. Click on this, you notice there's nothing in there because we haven't populated it yet. So now let's populate it with some stuff. We're going to go into graph trees, the default tree, and here's that gate section. So now we're going to add into that section. Under gate, it's now not a header. Instead though, we're going to create a graph. And that graph that we're going to go after is, remember those interfaces that we created on the switch? Well, here's the first one. We're going to create a traffic graph. It's populated in here. We're going to say that we want it to be hourly, 1 minute, and you can obviously choose different graph views here. We'll say create. And just like that, we've created now under the gate, we've created a switch section. So now if we go back to graphs, what you'll notice here is we've got now the amount of traffic coming in and out of this interface. This will take some time to populate, so I'm going to pause the video and we'll come back here in a minute. You can see now that this graph has been running for a while. It's not the most interesting of graphs because it's a very consistent amount of data coming outbound from the interface. It's running about 35 megabits. You can see the average and the maximum for both outbound and inbound here shown in this graph. From here I want to add one more graph, and I want it to be the CPU graph of this Cisco switch that we've added in there. So we'll go back to the console. We'll go back into our devices. We'll take a look at our switch. And here I can create a graph for this host. Now the graph I can create, you see this over here, is a Cisco CPU graph. Now there are other types of graphs that we can create, none really relevant to Cisco unless you know the OID, which I'll cover in a section later on using this generic OID template. But let's add the Cisco CPU graph. So here on the right, we'll highlight it and we'll say create. It's asking me the color choices. We have a lot of color choices that we can pick. We're going to choose the default. Hit create, and it created another graph for the switch, which is CPU usage. So now we're going to place it back on the graphs, because if you remember, the only one that we had in there for gate was our traffic. So we'll go into console, go into graph management, take a look at this CPU usage. I can highlight it from here, and then from there I can say place on tree the default tree. And from there I can choose a branch. Remember the section we created called gate. We'll say continue. And now we have our CPU usage added in as well. That's going to conclude this section of the video. Next up, we're going to customize Cacti even further for my use. Thanks for watching.